Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the complexity of source material, the history, the economics, the hard data, and try to extract the essential, fascinating insights you need to understand the world.
And today, we are really undertaking a massive mission.
We are. We're diving into the stunning contradictions of Mississippi.
It truly is a state defined by these stark contrasts. I mean, you look at the stack of sources we have, and on one hand, Mississippi proudly positions itself as the Magnolia State, the birthplace of America's music.
Right, a really rich cultural identity.
A very rich one. And yet, simultaneously, it consistently ranks 50th dead last in the nation for healthcare quality, and on top of that, holds the lowest per capita income.
That gap is just enormous, and that's really the heart of our mission today.
It is.
Absolutely. We have dense historical accounts, recent economic analyses, political breakdowns, and health reports. Our mission is to unpack all this material, to trace the line, to understand precisely how Mississippi's rich, complex, and, let's be honest, often painful history directly informs its present-day economy, its deep health challenges.
And this is maybe the biggest surprise in the whole thing.
It really is. Its recent dramatic educational successes. We want to give you a thorough understanding of this crucial Deep South state.
And just to set the table, the basic geography and demographics are the starting point. Mississippi is the 32nd largest state by area and the 35th most populous. Jackson is the capital and largest city.
And the state motto is Virtute et Armis.
Which means by valor and arms, a motto that, as we'll see, really reflects a long and very conflicted history.
And before we jump into the physical land itself, let's start with a quick nugget about the name. It's derived from the mighty Mississippi River, which of course forms its entire western border.
Right. European-American settlers named it after the Ojibwe phrase Mississippi,
which just means great river.
Great river. Yeah. A great river whose floods and power really dictated the state's earliest destiny.
So let's start there, with those geographic foundations and natural forces.
That river isn't just a border. It is, in a very real sense, the fundamental architect of Mississippi's physical existence. The state is almost entirely within the Gulf coastal plain.
Which means it's fundamentally low-lying.
Incredibly low-lying. The mean elevation is barely 300 feet above sea level. It's flat.
And when we talk about low elevation, we're talking about massive contrasts within that. The highest point, Woodall Mountain, is only 807 feet.
Which is more of a hill, really.
It's barely a mountain. And the lowest point is, of course, the Gulf of Mexico at 0 feet. This low-lying nature is so key because it simultaneously created this unimaginable agricultural wealth and also baked in a constant devastating vulnerability.
Exactly. And to understand that wealth, we have to focus on the Mississippi Delta region, this flat, unbelievably fertile area in the Northwest.
So this is geographically part of the vast Mississippi alluvial plain. What makes it so historically crucial is the soil composition, right?
It's not just dirt. You have to think of it as a living geological feature.
Right.
This land was formed over millennia by the regular, massive flooding of the Mississippi River. And every time it flooded, it deposited this incredibly rich, deep, silt-laden soil across the floodplain.
So the floods were both destructive and creative.
Paradoxically, yes. This bottomland was perfect for demanding high-yield crops. The regular and sometimes catastrophic floods were the engine that made the plantation economy possible. Without that alluvial plain, cotton is king, just doesn't happen the way it did.
But the subtropical climate that supports that agriculture also brings, well, environmental catastrophe.
The climate is humid subtropical. You get these mild winters, but then you have long, hot, and just overwhelmingly humid summers.
It's a heavy heat.
It is. But the geographic position near the Gulf Coast and the vast flat plain make the state highly susceptible to severe weather.
And we're talking about tornadoes here, primarily.
Yes. Mississippi averages about 27 tornadoes annually. And the historical record is just tragic. Our sources confirm that 2 of the 5 deadliest tornadoes in U.S. history happened within the state.
The first being the Great Natchez Tornado of 1840.
Which killed over 300 people, most of them on flatboats on the river itself. It's just a horrifying event. And then you have the Tupelo-Gainesville outbreak of 1936. This is a state that understands nature's immediate catastrophic power.
And then there is the threat from the Gulf. It's episodic, but it's absolutely devastating when it hits. We have 2 modern examples that really stand out in the sources.
Hurricane Camille and Hurricane Katrina.
Let's start with Camille.
Hurricane Camille in 1969 hit the coast as a Category 5 storm. The storm surge was estimated to be somewhere between 15 and 20 feet. It caused immense destruction.
It fundamentally reshaped the Gulf Coast.
It did, and it led to the deaths of 248 people in Mississippi alone. It was the benchmark for disaster for a generation.
And then the even greater catastrophe of Katrina in 2005.
Katrina was a Category 3 at its final landfall in Mississippi, but because of its sheer size, it generated this unprecedented storm surge that swept 90 miles of coastline clean.
Just gone.
Gone. We're talking about massive, nearly total destruction in cities like Gulfport, Biloxi, and Pascagoula. In Mississippi, 238 people died, and the estimated cost was in the tens of billions. The state had to fundamentally rely on federal intervention to rebuild.
So if that's the historical pattern, what do the sources tell us about the long-term threat, the one driven by climate change? What does this low-lying subtropical state face in the next 50 years?
The data is it's pretty alarming. An EPA report specifically singles out Mississippi, along with other Deep South states, as one of the areas projected to experience the worst effects of climate change in the United States.
And this directly impacts the foundation of the state's economy, agriculture.
Right, and it's a devastating paradox, isn't it?
It is. How so?
Well, the EPA predicts increased severity of both floods and droughts. For a state that relies on its alluvial soil for production, this dual-threat unpredictable dryness followed by devastating saturation is going to drastically reduce crop yields and stress the already vulnerable agricultural sector.
And just living there is going to get harder.
Yes, the overall temperatures will warm, making those already hot and humid summers more dangerous for outdoor workers.
And for the coast, the threat of sea level rise isn't abstract, it's immediate.
It is. The sources show sea level is already rising about 1 inch every 7 years. Given the flat topography, this is a profound threat. A small increase in sea level vastly expands the area that's vulnerable to storm surge during even moderate tropical storms.
So the very foundation that created the state's historical wealth is now the source of its greatest long-term vulnerability.
That's the core tension right there.
Okay, so let's unpack the human history, because the roots of the modern paradox are right here. We have to start well before the Europeans ever arrived.
We begin with the Paleo-Indians, dating back to 9500 BC. And over time, these hunter-gatherer societies evolved into these very complex successor cultures.
We're talking the woodland and ultimately the Mississippian eras.
Right, beginning around 950 AD. And these were the so-called mound builder cultures.
And what stands out about their societal organization? I mean, these weren't simple, isolated groups.
Not at all. They were highly sophisticated. They built these massive, often ceremonial earthworks, and they maintained extensive trading networks that connected communities from the Great Lakes all the way down to the Gulf Coast.
They were trading things like copper, shells.
Specific raw materials over vast distances. These cultures were the direct ancestors of the historic Native American tribes we recognize today.
And those descendants include the major nations of the area, like the Chickasaw and the Choctaw, and then smaller groups like the Natchez, the Yazoo, and the Biloxi.
Then came the European chapter. While, Hernando de Soto's Spanish expedition passed through in 1540, permanent European settlement was a French endeavor.
Starting in 1699 with the establishment of Fort Maurepas, or Old Biloxi, on the Gulf Coast.
Exactly. They later founded Natchez, further upriver, in 1716.
And it was under French and then Spanish rule that a really unique societal layer developed, especially in Natchez and along the Gulf.
Yes, we are talking about the gens de cause libre, or free people of color. The sources show these were often mixed-race descendants, usually the children of European men and enslaved or free African women.
And unlike later American antebellum society, this group held a really distinct, acknowledged social capital.
They weren't just free individuals. They often became the educated professional class artisans, merchants, property owners, and sometimes even slave owners themselves. They occupied a status that was designed to buffer the rigid social structure between the European elite and the enslaved majority.
But that demographic setup was, well, it was unsustainable once the territory was acquired by the United States.
Completely. That led to a massive influx of European-American migrants, primarily from older southern states where decades of tobacco farming had just exhausted the soil.
And these migrants were incredibly eager to exploit the rich Delta land.
And their arrival immediately put immense aggressive pressure on the federal government to expel the Native American tribes.
Which culminates in one of the darkest moments of American history, the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830.
This resulted in the forced removal of the Choctaw people, a part of what became known as the Trail of Tears. It was a brutal displacement to lands west of the Mississippi River.
But the sources highlight a critical, nuanced detail in that removal process, Article 14 of the treaty.
Right. Article 14 was essentially a mechanism of state coercion. It stated that those Choctaw who chose to remain in Mississippi and become U.S. citizens had to give up their tribal membership and accept individual land allotments.
A divisive and incredibly painful choice.
A terrible choice. The descendants of those who chose to remain are the contemporary Mississippi band of Choctaw Indians who retained a small land base in the central part of the state, distinct from the majority who were forced west.
If that history sets the stage, the next era is where the paradox of Mississippi's present day is truly forged: the rise of cotton and the immense wealth built on slavery.
By the 1850s, the planters, particularly those who had moved into the newly cleared and unbelievably fertile delta regions, became extraordinarily wealthy.
They were profiting from a deadly trifecta.
That's a good way to put it. You have the most fertile land in the world, extremely high global cotton prices driven by the textile industry, and of course the zero-cost labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved African Americans.
Let's put numbers to that exploitation because it really defines the state's identity.
The demographic reality of 1860 is shocking. Out of a total population of approximately 790,000, 55%, that's 436,631 people, were enslaved.
So it was a majority slave state.
It wasn't just a state with slaves. It was fundamentally a massive, successful slave labor camp. It was the undisputed top cotton-producing state in the entire nation.
And connecting this back to the core mission, that slave-derived wealth was so immense that pre-Civil War, Mississippi was ranked as the 5th wealthiest state nationally on a per capita basis.
That is the ghost that still haunts the state's economy. The elite's reluctance to invest that immense capital into public infrastructure, like railroads or widespread public education.
They invested it in land and human property.
Purely. And that was a short-sighted decision that starved the state of fundamental growth mechanisms for the next 150 years. It leads directly to its modern poverty rankings.
The stage for conflict was set, and Mississippi was quick to act, becoming the second state to declare its secession from the Union on January 9, 1861.
The Civil War was existential for Mississippi because of the strategic importance of the river. The Union objective was crystal clear: gain control of the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy in two.
Which made the siege of Vicksburg a lengthy, pivotal campaign absolutely essential.
Its fall in July 1863 was a turning point in the entire war.
And it's fascinating that even in a state so dedicated to secession, there were these internal Unionist pockets.
Yes. The most famous example is the so-called Free State of Jones, where a man named Newton Knight led a band of pro-Union deserters and anti-Confederate neighbors.
So it shows that Mississippi was never a monolith.
Never. Not even during the peak of the conflict. There were significant class and ideological splits, particularly among poor white farmers who did not own slaves and resented the planter elite.
The post-war Reconstruction era, however, brought a truly revolutionary moment, especially with the 1868 Constitutional Convention.
This was a brief, brilliant window of radical change. For the first time, black and white delegates worked together.
And the convention adopted sweeping reforms designed to build a functioning modern democracy.
They did. They ratified the 14th Amendment, they adopted universal male suffrage, they removed property qualifications for voting or holding office, which was a huge win for poor whites alongside freedmen.
And crucially, they established the state's first comprehensive public school system.
Mandated for all children, regardless of race. A truly radical idea for its time and place.
But the sources show that window was violently slammed shut by the Democratic backlash. We need to detail this mechanism of suppression. It was known as the Mississippi Plan.
The Mississippi Plan was initiated around 1875 by white Democrats seeking to reclaim political control and to reestablish white supremacy. It was an organized campaign of intimidation and violence.
And it involved these paramilitary groups.
Most notoriously, the Red Shirts, who operated in what they called white line campaigns.
How extensive was this violence? I mean, was it sporadic or was it organized?
It was systematic and lethal. Our sources detailed the Vicksburg and Clinton massacres of 1874 and 1875, where armed groups suppressed black voting and killed at least 150 black citizens.
So this was terrorism.
It was political terrorism. The violence and intimidation were so severe that it suppressed Republican turnout and forced elected black officials out of office, effectively ending the biracial government by the end of 1875.
And this political violence then culminates in the institutionalized legal disenfranchisement that's codified in the 1890 Constitution.
This Constitution was openly and brutally explicit in its aims. Democratic Governor James K. Vardaman famously stated its purpose was to eliminate the nigger from politics.
Just saying it out loud.
Right. But the genius, in a cynical sense, of the 1890 Constitution was its mechanism of disenfranchisement. It didn't mention race explicitly, which theoretically made it pass federal scrutiny at the time.
So what were those specific mechanisms? We need to know the how.
There were three main barriers. First, the imposition of a poll tax, which disproportionately burdened poor citizens, both black and white.
Second, literacy tests.
Right. And third, and this was the most pernicious, the understanding clause. This provision required a voter to be able to read any section of the state constitution or demonstrate a reasonable understanding of it when it was read to them.
That sounds reasonable on paper, but the reality was far different.
It was entirely arbitrary. White registrars were granted total, unchallengeable power to decide who demonstrated understanding.
So if you were black,
You were often given the most obscure, archaic, or complex passages to interpret. If you were a white farmer who couldn't read, you might be asked to explain what a ballot was.
and the effect was immediate.
It immediately removed about 100,000 black men and, notably, 50,000 poor white men from the voter rolls. It established a single-party democratic state that would last for nearly a century.
Let's pivot back to economics for a moment, because amidst this political suppression, there was a fleeting moment of immense economic achievement among African Americans, especially in the Delta.
This is one of the great short-lived triumphs of the post-war era. The Delta was still largely frontier land, and freedmen and white migrants poured in, clearing timber and working incredibly hard to buy property.
And by 1900, the sources show an astonishing number.
2/3 of the farm owners in the Mississippi Delta were African American.
Yeah.
It was a massive statement of independence and economic success.
But economic forces and the structure of debt traps quickly crushed that success.
Unfortunately. Falling global cotton prices in the early 20th century were devastating, coupled with the lack of access to credit, the institutionalized disenfranchisement, and the rise of debt peonage systems like sharecropping.
They just couldn't hold on.
Most black farmers couldn't weather the economic storms. They lost their land and were rapidly pushed back into landless labor and poverty by the 1920s.
And that complete lack of political rights, combined with economic debt traps and violence, fueled the single largest demographic shift in the state's history.
The Great Migration.
Exactly.
Starting around 1913 and continuing through 1970, nearly 500,000 people, the vast majority African American, left Mississippi.
They were seeking not just jobs, but escape.
Escape from a violent, oppressive system where the ability to vote, to educate their children, to simply live without fear was impossible.
And the impact on the state's demographics was immediate and transformative.
It was. Mississippi had been a majority black state since before the Civil War. But due to this massive exodus, the African American population became a minority population in the state after the 1930s.
This flight, driven by lack of opportunity, fundamentally redefined the state's identity and its labor pool for the rest of the 20th century.
It's an incredible irony, isn't it, that the intense conditions of oppression and poverty we just discussed gave rise to some of the most influential and foundational American art forms.
It is. Let's talk about that cultural legacy, starting with music.
Mississippi is not just a birthplace. It is the undisputed birthplace of the blues. This music emerged directly from the harsh reality of the Delta, the sharecropping system, the isolation, the backbreaking labor.
The songs provided a voice to the voiceless.
They did. They gave structure and poetry to the experience of oppression.
But the sources also compel us to look past simple racial categories and see the cross-pollination that really created American music.
That's where it gets truly interesting. You see figures like Jimmie Rodgers, who is widely celebrated as the father of country music. Rodgers was white, but he learned from and played with local black blues musicians.
So he was absorbing their rhythms and structures.
Completely. He was friends with blues legends like Chester Arthur Burnett, who you'd know as Howlin' Wolf.
So this wasn't segregation. This was cultural fusion happening despite the intense social segregation.
Exactly. It was the fusion of black musical traditions with the Scots-Irish folk and hymn traditions that permeated the white Southern communities.
And this blend created the basis for country, jazz, modern blues, and eventually
The ultimate symbol of this crossover. Tupelo native Elvis Presley, who brought those Delta sounds to a massive global, multiracial audience, becoming the king of rock and roll.
For listeners who want to dive into that history physically, the Mississippi Blues Trail marks over 200 sites dedicated to this legacy, including key locations like the Riverside Hotel in Clarksdale.
Right. And pivoting from culture to faith, religion remains perhaps the single most defining social force in Mississippi today.
It is consistently ranked the most religious state in the U.S.
And the statistics really bear that out. Our sources show that 59% of Mississippians consider themselves very religious.
And 63% report attending church weekly or almost weekly. That's the highest rate nationally.
It is. The population is overwhelmingly Christian, at 84% predominantly Protestant, with the Southern Baptist Convention being the largest single denomination.
And this deep religious foundation has profoundly shaped the political and social landscape.
For sure. Sources point out that the massive growth of fundamentalist conservative churches since the 1970s has directly fueled the conservative political trends among white residents.
But historically, particularly for African Americans, the church was the engine of liberation.
Precisely. During the Civil Rights Movement, black churches were absolutely pivotal. They were the only autonomous institutions black residents possessed.
So there were communication networks, meeting places,
Shelters, and most importantly, the organizational hub for activism and voter registration campaigns against immense organized resistance.
and that resistance was not just sporadic violence. It was officially organized and tax-supported by the state itself.
That's a critical piece of context.
Yeah.
In 1954, the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission was created. It was funded by state taxes, claiming to work for state unity.
But its real purpose was something else entirely.
Its real purpose was to operate as a domestic spy agency. It surveilled thousands of Mississippians, collecting intelligence on anyone suspected of civil rights activities, and used that information to assist local white citizens' councils.
What kind of assistance are we talking about?
Well, they provided funding, organizational support, and crucial intelligence used for economic blackmail. So, for instance, if a black person tried to register to vote, the commission might tip off a local citizens' council.
And they would then pressure local banks to deny them loans or fire them from jobs or cut off their supplies.
Exactly. This was a system designed to suppress activism through economic starvation.
The brutal climax of this era was the 1964 Freedom Summer Campaign, where students poured into the state to register voters and set up freedom schools.
And Freedom Summer was met with intense state-sanctioned violence and chaos. The most famous tragedy, of course, was the murder of civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner near Philadelphia, Mississippi.
That specific act of violence, along with countless others, was broadcast nationally.
And it became a crucial catalyst for the federal government to finally pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which began the slow, painful process of undoing the disenfranchisement of 1890.
Now, if we shift from that painful history to the modern social landscape, there's a demographic detail that really challenges the monolithic view of the Deep South.
It's one of those moments where the sources force you to recognize the complexity of modern identity in the state.
Because historically, Mississippi has been characterized by deeply conservative social politics rooted in its dominant religious culture.
Right. But when we look at family structure, Mississippi actually leads the nation in one specific, non-traditional metric.
Which is?
The state has the highest proportion of same-sex couples raising children in the U.S., hovering around 33% according to recent studies.
That is surprising.
It is. It suggests a quieter, more resilient, and perhaps more family-oriented LGBT community than the national narrative often allows for. Furthermore, Jackson ranks 10th in the nation for the concentration of African-American same-sex couples.
So it points to a diverse urban reality that's often obscured by the rural, socially conservative politics.
Exactly.
Let's return to the economic facts, because they really define the state's current status. We started by noting the tension. Lowest per capita income, yet high in charitable contributions. This structural poverty is deeply managed and often masked by external financial factors.
And the largest factor there is federal spending. Mississippi's economy is heavily subsidized.
So the state consistently receives one of the highest ratios of federal spending to taxes received in the entire nation.
It does. In 2005, for example, largely due to Hurricane Katrina recovery funds, the state received 2.02 cents for every dollar paid in taxes. That ranked second highest nationally.
But that subsidy isn't just disaster relief, though. It's consistent.
It is. A significant portion comes from large federal installations, like Camp Shelby and Keesler Air Force Base, which employ thousands of residents, alongside federal highway funding and healthcare expenditures. Without this federal transfer, the state's economic standing will be far, far worse.
In terms of actual output, agriculture is still vital.
Indeed, it has specialized. Mississippi is the top producer of farm-raised catfish nationally, a multi-million-dollar industry, and it's also a major producer of sweet potatoes, cotton, and plywood.
But speaking of struggles, let's pivot to how the state chooses to raise its own revenue, because this is a point that really demands scrutiny. The sources reveal a very uncomfortable statistic about taxation.
Yes, we are talking about the retail sales tax on groceries.
Okay.
Mississippi levies a 7% retail sales tax on groceries, which is the highest grocery tax in the entire United States.
Wait, so in the poorest state in the country, the sources show they hit residents with the highest consumption tax on a necessity on food. How? How does that make sense?
That is the critical question. The political rationale is that the state relies heavily on consumption taxes to fund government services because of its low overall tax base and low property values.
But the economic impact is clear. A 7% tax on food is highly regressive.
It places a disproportionately heavy burden on lower-income families who already spend a larger percentage of their earnings on basic necessities. The policy choice directly exacerbates the poverty it is attempting to manage.
That reliance on consumption is why the introduction of entertainment revenue was so economically transformative. The 1990 decision to legalize casino gambling was a massive economic pivot.
It was a complete game changer. Legalized gambling along the Mississippi River Tunica became the massive center of this, and the Gulf Coast, like Gulfport and Biloxi, rapidly became major economic drivers.
Before Hurricane Katrina, Mississippi was actually the second largest gambling state in the U.S.,
trailing only Nevada. That's how big it was.
And when Katrina destroyed the coastal infrastructure, the law had to change to save that industry.
Exactly. Before Katrina, the casinos had to be built on barges or floating structures, often just offshore. When the storm surge wiped them out, the legislature quickly changed the law, allowing casinos to rebuild on land, provided they were within 800 feet of the water.
It was an economic necessity.
Completely. Without that change, the state would have lost its vital gaming tax revenue entirely.
To understand the difficulty the state has in attracting sustainable, high-wage manufacturing, we have to look at a notorious failure that cost the state millions.
The green tech automotive fiasco.
Right.
This case study is a perfect example of what can go wrong when high-stakes incentives are deployed without sufficient oversight. Green Tech Automotive, an electric car manufacturer, promised to bring a revolutionary new product and sustainable jobs to Tunica County.
One of the poorest areas of the Delta.
Exactly. The promises were huge.
What were the specifics?
The state was promised a $60 million investment and the creation of 350 full-time jobs. In return, the company received significant state incentives totaling $6 million, including tax breaks and local bonds. The hope was that this investment would pull the Delta out of its post-agricultural slump.
And the reality was far removed from the promise.
Far removed. The plant ultimately produced few, if any, street-legal cars. The state auditor later found the company was largely a game of smoke and mirrors.
And internal records confirm they never employed more than 94 full-time workers in Mississippi at any point.
A huge political scandal erupted as state officials demanded repayment.
And what was the final resolution on that?
After declaring bankruptcy, the ultimate resolution was deeply disappointing. A final settlement in 2020 only returned $575,000 back to the state and county.
A fraction of the $6 million in incentives.
A tiny fraction. This failure highlighted the vulnerability of Mississippi to high-risk speculative manufacturing investments and the difficulty in realizing promised job creation.
Let's turn now to the political landscape. Because despite the economic and social struggles, the state has recently addressed some of its most entrenched historic barriers to democracy.
First, we have to acknowledge the ongoing context of voting barriers. Mississippi is ranked the fourth hardest state for citizens to vote in, partly due to the residual complexity of its voting laws.
And it also continues to have the highest rate of African-American disenfranchisement in the U.S.
Estimated at around 16%, primarily due to laws that bar convicted felons from voting unless their rights are restored.
However, a massive historical wrong was finally righted in 2020 regarding gubernatorial elections. This takes us directly back to that 1890 Jim Crow Constitution.
This is a remarkable story of institutional inertia finally being overcome. The 1890 Constitution mandated an explicitly Jim Crow-era election law for the governor, sometimes called Mississippi's own electoral college.
So a candidate had to win both the statewide popular vote and a majority of the 122 districts in the state House of Representatives.
Right, and this was designed to minimize black political power.
How's it?
By requiring a candidate to win district majorities, The law ensured that state representatives, who often represented districts carefully gerrymandered to suppress black influence, could overturn the statewide popular will. If no candidate met both requirements, the House got to choose the winner.
It was a political safety valve.
A safety valve designed to prevent an African-American candidate, even one who won the popular vote, from taking the state's highest office.
But the people finally spoke in 2020.
They did. In a statewide referendum, 79% of Mississippians voted to remove this antique, racist election law.
So now the state simply requires a runoff election if no candidate wins the majority.
Yes, thereby dismantling a century-old institutional barrier to political equality. It was a huge step.
And this move to remove historical barriers contrasts sharply with the state's continued passage of restrictive social laws. We have to look at HB 1523 from 2016.
HB 1523, the Protecting Freedom of Conscience from Government Forced Actions Act, was one of the most comprehensive religious freedom laws passed in the U.S. It codified 3 specific religious or moral beliefs.
That marriage is between a man and a woman.
That sexual relations should only occur within such a marriage, and that gender is determined by the sex assigned at birth.
And what did the law allow in practice?
It allowed individuals and businesses to refuse services to same-sex couples or transgender individuals based on those codified religious beliefs. This included employment decisions, housing decisions by landlords, and refusal of services by wedding vendors.
And it was challenged, but what was the outcome?
Although it was initially blocked by a federal judge, a federal appeals court upheld the law in 2017, arguing the plaintiffs lacked standing to challenge it, which means the law remains in effect today.
Finally, we must note the impact Mississippi has had on national jurisprudence, specifically regarding its penal system.
The 2021 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Jones v. Mississippi upheld a state law allowing judges to impose mandatory life imprisonment without parole for children convicted of murder, even when the judge did not specifically find the offender was permanently incorrigible.
So you have these contrasting actions, removing historical voting barriers while simultaneously upholding restrictive social and penal laws.
It shows the complex, divided political soul of the modern state.
Okay, now we arrive at the central, painful contradiction of the state today. We've seen the historical drivers of poverty, but let's examine the dire results in public health. Mississippi ranks 50th last place among all U.S. states for healthcare.
The data is not just core, it is catastrophic. Mississippi has the highest rates nationally for infant and neonatal deaths, which speaks volumes about maternal health and prenatal care access.
And on top of that, it records the highest death rates from major chronic conditions.
Heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, and adult inactivity. It's across the board.
The obesity crisis is not just an indicator, it's a deep, entrenched public health emergency.
It is persistent. The sources show that for 3 consecutive years, more than 30% of Mississippi residents were classified as obese, leading the nation during that period. And the contributing factors are structural, rooted in the socioeconomic framework.
We need to connect the dots here. What are the specific structural issues fueling these health outcomes?
Well, the lack of medical care accessibility is key. Mississippi is a state that has consistently declined to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act.
Which leaves hundreds of thousands of low-income residents without affordable coverage.
And compounding this, rural areas, particularly in the Delta, suffer from hospital closures, meaning emergency and preventative care often requires traveling hundreds of miles.
And beyond just clinical care, there are also the factors tied to food and the environment.
Absolutely. You see widespread poverty that limits access to healthy foods, which leads to the proliferation of food deserts areas where residents lack easy access to supermarkets and fresh produce.
So they're relying on high-calorie, low-nutrient convenience store options.
Exactly. And previous intervention strategies have often failed because they were not culturally sensitive or practical for low-income, geographically isolated African-American populations. The crisis is not just medical, it's a direct result of political and economic structural decisions.
This is the shadow side of the state, firmly rooted in its history of systemic poverty. But we pivot now to the area where Mississippi has achieved stunning, rapid success: education. The state has engineered a turnaround so profound, it's now referred to as the Mississippi Miracle.
And to appreciate the miracle, you really have to remember the low starting point. Historically, education was segregated until the late 1960s. When integration finally arrived, the subsequent white flight to private segregation academies in many areas destabilized and starved public school funding for decades.
And their academic results reflected this instability for a long time.
They did. As recently as 2007, Mississippi was ranked among the absolute worst in the nation. They scored the lowest of any state on the National Assessments of Educational Progress, or NAEP.
In both math and science, and they had the lowest average ACT scores.
Students were performing a full grade level below the national average. It was a crisis.
So how did they pull off this extraordinary turnaround? We need to know the specific policy and curriculum changes that drove this success.
This is the core nugget of knowledge from this section. The dramatic educational transformation is attributed to a series of focused state-level policy changes implemented starting around 2013. This wasn't just an incremental adjustment, it was a fundamental pedagogical shift.
And what was the flagship policy behind this?
The flagship was the Literacy-Based Promotion Act, or LBPA. This law instituted a strict third-grade reading gate.
Meaning, if students can't demonstrate basic reading proficiency by the end of third grade, they generally are not promoted to the fourth grade.
That's right. It put an intense focus on early literacy and high-quality instruction from day one.
And what accompanied that reading gate? It wasn't just the one policy.
No, the state mandated the adoption of high-quality, research-based curricula across districts, specifically focusing on the science of reading. They also introduced new, rigorous accountability systems for schools and provided intensive training for teachers in these new curricula.
So it was a statewide, multi-million-dollar investment focused squarely on elementary reading skills.
It was a very focused, very intentional effort.
And the results were almost immediate and sustained.
They were stark. By 2024, in those crucial NAEP scores, which are the national benchmark, Mississippi students were performing a half-grade level above the average U.S. student.
Going from last place to above the national average in a single decade, especially given the state's severe poverty challenges, it's an astonishing, unprecedented reversal of fortune.
It really is.
What a journey through contrast and contradiction. So to summarize, we have a state defined by its foundational culture, its music, its deep religious faith, and its unique river-fed geography. But a state still fundamentally navigating the immense economic and social burdens left by a history rooted in massive-scale plantation agriculture and the extreme racial disenfranchisement codified in 1890.
It's a place where immense historical wealth contrasts so sharply with modern poverty, where structural decisions like the highest grocery tax in the nation exacerbate the underlying issues, and where political progress, like removing the Jim Crow election law, moves forward while social barriers like HB 1523 remain in place.
Yet, the existence of the Mississippi Miracle in education gives us this tangible proof that systemic, intentional change is possible, even in the most entrenched environments.
And that leads to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over long after this deep dive is complete.
Okay.
Mississippi has successfully engineered a dramatic educational miracle in a single decade, moving from the very bottom to above the national average. Given that incredible achievement, which required political will, specific policy implementation, and dedicated resource allocation, what does this reveal about the sheer difficulty, complexity, and perhaps the political resistance involved in addressing its parallel and equally entrenched crisis in public health, where it remains firmly ranks last in the nation?
What is the secret to scaling one remarkable success, moving the academic needle, to solve the other deeply embedded life and death problem of public wellness?
Something to ponder as you connect the history of the Delta to the data of today.
We appreciate you joining us for this rigorous look into the heart of the Deep South.